You ever notice how some people leave like they're completely done? No emotion, no long explanation, sometimes just silence. And then weeks or months later, they come back. Not always with a big apology, not always with clarity. Sometimes it's just a message like nothing ever happened. And if you're the one on the receiving end of that, it can feel confusing, even frustrating, because you start to wonder, if they left, why do they come back? And why does it feel like they can't fully stay away? This is where a lot of people start using the term super empath, not as a clinical label, but more as a social media concept. It's used to describe someone who is emotionally attuned, consistent, and relationally grounding, often without trying too hard. And when that kind of person connects with someone who has avoidant attachment patterns, something interesting happens. There's a push-pull dynamic that doesn't fully resolve. So let's break it down. First, what's actually happening with avoidance? When we say avoidant, we're usually talking about avoidant attachment style, not a personality flaw. People with this pattern often learned early on that emotional closeness wasn't always safe, consistent, or manageable. So instead of fully leaning into connection, their nervous system developed a protective response. If things get too close, I need distance to feel okay again. This isn't always conscious. It shows up automatically through what psychologists sometimes call deactivating strategies. That might look like pulling away when intimacy increases, becoming emotionally distant, reducing communication, focusing on flaws in the relationship, or suddenly needing space. Not because they don't care, but because closeness starts to feel like pressure in their nervous system. And here's the key point. For avoidance, intimacy and overwhelm can register at the same time. So the system tries to regulate by creating distance. So where does the super empath come in? In social media language, a super empath is usually described as someone who stays emotionally consistent, responds with understanding rather than escalation, doesn't chase in panic, and maintains emotional stability even when things get confusing. In psychological terms, this often overlaps with secure attachment traits, emotional regulation skills, high emotional intelligence, and low reactivity under stress. Now here's where the dynamic gets interesting. For someone with avoidant tendencies, a stable emotional presence can feel safe, grounding, unfamiliar, and sometimes emotionally activating in a different way, because they're not being chased in chaos, but they're also not being emotionally abandoned. So there's no clear escape pressure and no clear threat. And that creates tension. When things start getting emotionally close, the avoidance system can go into what's called attachment system deactivation. This is where emotional closeness gets temporarily turned down in the nervous system. Not because connection is unwanted, but because the intensity feels like too much to process at once. So the mind shifts into independence mode, emotional distance, reduced communication, or full withdrawal. From the outside, it looks like they just switched off, but internally it's more like, I need distance to regulate what I'm feeling. This is why they pull away in the first place. But then comes the part people struggle to understand. Why do they come back after leaving? This is where we bring in emotional recalibration. Once distance is created, the nervous system calms down. The intensity drops. And what felt overwhelming before no longer feels overwhelming. So now the internal experience shifts from I need space to that connection wasn't actually unsafe, it just felt intense. And that opens the door for reconnection. But here's the important detail. They don't always come back because something changed in the relationship. They come back because their internal emotional state changed. Another layer is intermittent reinforcement. When connection is present, then absent, then present again, it creates what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement. And this is powerful because unpredictability increases emotional salience. The brain pays more attention to inconsistent rewards than stable ones, and it creates a loop of anticipation and emotional activation. So even when someone pulls away, the bond doesn't just disappear. It stays mentally active, not always in a healthy way, but in a persistent one. That's why these dynamics feel so sticky. And this also explains why the return often feels so casual. When avoidants come back, it can feel like no closure, no acknowledgement, no emotional weight. That's because internally, for them, it doesn't always feel like a break happened. It feels more like, I needed space, now I'm back. Meanwhile, the other person experienced emotional confusion, uncertainty, and processing time. So there's a mismatch in emotional timelines. One person is continuing a story, the other feels like they just re-entered it. Now let's talk about why the bond feels hard to escape. When people say, can't escape a super empath, what they're usually describing isn't literal inability to leave, but emotional imprinting through stability. When someone consistently offers calm communication, emotional understanding, non-reactive presence, and safety in interaction, it creates something called secure relational imprinting. This means the nervous system starts associating that person with regulation rather than chaos. For someone used to emotional unpredictability, that can feel grounding, calming, and hard to fully detach from emotionally. So even when they leave, the internal association remains. That connection felt different. And that's what brings them back. Not always love in the romantic sense, but emotional regulation memory. When you zoom out, the pattern often looks like this. Connection builds, emotional closeness increases, avoidant system feels pressure, withdrawal happens, distance reduces emotional intensity, system calms, reconnection feels possible again. They return, and the cycle restarts. And if you're the consistent one in that cycle, it can slowly start shaping your emotional expectations without you realizing it. Because the return becomes meaningful, sometimes more meaningful than consistency ever was. But here's the important truth most people miss. Understanding this pattern is not about blaming avoidance or idealizing super empaths or turning attachment styles into labels for behavior. It's about recognizing dynamics. Because the real question isn't just, why do they come back? It becomes, what does this cycle create in me over time? Does it create clarity, or does it create emotional looping? Does it feel stable, or does it keep resetting your emotional baseline? And when you understand this pattern clearly, something shifts. You stop reacting to each moment as if it exists in isolation. The silence is not random. The return is not magic. The connection is not undefined. It's a cycle with psychological structure underneath it. And once you can see that clearly, you're no longer just inside it. You're observing it. You're now in a better place in deciding how to move forward from here on.